So thank you everybody for joining us for this session. We're going to be speaking here about green hydrogen corridors. And I will say a little bit about what I think they are, and I'm sure my panelists will have their opinion of what they think green hydrogen corridors are. But I'll first introduce my panelists. We have a very strong and a very varied lineup covering a lot of ground. So immediately to my left, we have Aida Sitdikova, Head of Energy and Sustainability for Eurasia at EBRD. Gauri Singh, the Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency. Tancock, CEO of InterContinental Energy. Luc Koechlin, CEO of EDF Middle East. And Yusuf Macun, Managing Partner of Cranmore Partners. So we have, as you see, a great range of people covering finance, international business, intergovernmental organizations, and international finance. And green corridors, I think an emerging topic. And the interesting thing, we hear a lot of talk when we speak about hydrogen production costs and where is it best produced and how and so on. But we also, of course, are very aware that a big issue with hydrogen is transporting it and getting it from where it's made to where it's going to be used. And in contrast to, let's say, oil or gas, there are multiple ways in which you can do this. And the way in which it can be transported, whether as hydrogen, pure hydrogen, or in some kind of chemical form, whether as ammonia or methanol or another synthetic fuel, or converted into a useful product like green steel or something else, and transporting an end product itself. And as I see the corridors, the corridors are a way to get hydrogen from one point to another, but they're also a driver for economic development and sustainability along the corridor itself. And of course, a very key part of that is the energy consumption and associated industry and so on that goes on with the shipping industry. And again, we have the question, if you're transporting hydrogen and many other fuels and energy products by ship, how are those ships themselves fueled? Are they also green ships? And are they using ammonia or methanol or something else to run in a green way? And then how do you combine that with the port logistics? I mean, the global ports industry is immensely complex, developed over centuries. We're now going to be replacing a significant part of this with low carbon alternatives. So how do we do that? So I'd just like to start off our discussion. And if I can maybe turn the clock back a few decades. Alex, perhaps I think you could kick us off with your perspectives on, if we look back at the history of other innovative energy products and systems over the past few decades, what can we learn from how those developed, and that might be ways to bring forward the development of green hydrogen corridors?
Yeah, no, great, thanks. And I think that's a really good point, because if we look back, towards the beginning of wind and solar industry, I've only been in it for about 25 years, but it goes back about 40 years now. You can see how that developed. And then you can even further back to the nuclear industry and to the LNG industry, which are now 65 years old. And effectively, they were driven by the wealthier countries who, either for environmental reasons or energy security reasons, decided they wanted these pathways for energy to be developed. And for a really long time, it took a concerted effort on a policy level and a subsidy level to make this happen. Now, the difference between at least 3 of those technologies and what we're trying to do with green hydrogen is that whether you're doing wind, solar, or nuclear, you're subsidizing a local industry for local consumption, and all of that value chain stays locally. So if you choose to spend more on your energy, and you eventually, the costs come down through these virtuous cycles, that's a policy choice you can make, and it's sort of easy to understand as a voter or as a citizen. I think one of the troubles we have with green hydrogen, in a way, is that you've got this problem where some of the, let's say, global south countries have the resource, but at the moment there's some expectation that the more developed countries will pay to develop there. But that's not how we developed things in the past. So if we're going to see this kind of development in the global south in the near term, it's a completely different model to what we've seen happen with the last 4 energy technologies that came out. And then if you look at where, again, if some parallels to those previous developments, is that where in the world today are policymakers, supportive of hydrogen, but also putting financial support behind hydrogen? It's the United States, it's Europe, it's the Middle East increasingly, it's Australia. And so realistically, that's where you're going to see the projects. Some of us may not like that from a development perspective, but the reality is cost of capital matters. And of course, lower risks in more developed countries allow for lower cost of capital, and subsidies and policy support matter. So, I think in the near term, we can probably look to some of the old developments as parallels of how things might play out in the near future.
Right, thank you. And, talking about that questions of infrastructure development and finance and the global south-north trade, I wonder, Aida, if you could give us your thoughts. As you say, your mandate extends from Morocco to
Mongolia.
To Mongolia, yes, the two M's, at either end of Eurasia. Huge landmass with a lot of wind and solar and so on. Could you give us your thoughts there on green hydrogen corridors within that huge area? How do they develop, and how do you link up the producing areas and the consuming areas for projects like hydrogen?
Right. I think it's indeed a big region. It's from Mongolia to Morocco, east to west, and it's from the Baltics to Greece, north-south. So, but two pronounced global south, global north areas. And to date, we have financed two projects, two green hydrogen projects, one in Egypt, one in Uzbekistan. There are some lessons learned. We're still sort of learning. But what we are seeing is, it all comes down to cost. And on the cost side, we see that the uptake of green hydrogen, at least in our region, is not there. We see, of course, it was mentioned of IRA, there's CBAM in Europe, but we don't know if it's the costs. Do we scale up the costs first? Do we scale up to reduce the costs, or do we create the subsidy environment that would help? To me, it's becoming a bit circular. How do we do that? And we think it should be moving in parallel, meaning there should be in our countries, there should be enabling environment, and we do a lot on that, helping countries develop hydrogen strategies, for example. But also there have to be larger scale projects in the pipeline. So, the big immediate question in terms of green corridors for us is, should we place the production of hydrogen at the point of renewable generation, or should it be at the point of consumption and demand? Our modality, and we've done both types. The project in Egypt, for example, is an export-oriented project with offtake in Europe. The project in Uzbekistan is for a local fertilizer producer, excuse me, which is all local. One point I would like to mention here in terms of green corridors and connecting global south to global north and letting global south countries realize their export potential is not forgetting the decarbonization aspect within the countries themselves. So yes, it's about job creation, it's about greening up the manufacturing base, it's about all this great localization, all great stuff, but importantly also, it's decarbonizing the countries themselves. And here we think green hydrogen should not be exclusively or export-oriented. There should be a balance between decarbonization efforts in Europe and growth development agenda in the global south. So we think it has to be done holistically and comprehensively. And green corridors, final maybe point, back to the question, where should we produce green hydrogen? It could be, it could be electrons, it could be molecules, it could be transmission lines passing the renew, and we see in our region already the Black Sea cable, the Trans-Caspian cable, to export renewables. But again, how do the countries themselves benefit? Because our countries, if Kazakhstan or Morocco, for example, which are seriously looking at green hydrogen, if they commit the gigawatts of capacity for green exports to Europe, but while continuing to import, in Morocco's case, coal, or in Kazakhstan, continuing to burn available coal, what's the point? Or Egypt, exporting green hydrogen to EU and buying expensive gas as import.
Yes, thank you. And I think that's a very important point on the financing side. And Yusuf, you work very extensively on financing of green hydrogen projects in various places including around the MENA region. Could you give us your thoughts on what underpins the financing of those projects and how that depends on the end use and the final destination?
Sure, thank you. You're right, it comes down to the same drivers. What underpins the financing? Obviously, offtake, commercial viability, that's where it starts, right? Of course, you need to have the right contractual structure and the right risk allocation, etc. But when I was learning project finance, one of the senior guys teaching to us had come and said, look, there's no such thing as take or pay, it's take or mitigate. So commercial viability is where it starts. And as part of that offtake, and actually the midstream, the corridors that we're talking about, be they pipelines, be they ships, etc., they require willing buyers at a price that's attractive to them. There's no way around that. The key challenge that we are facing, obviously, is the famous delta or premium that's needed in the interim, and who will pay for it. And especially in the context of globalization being questioned and public finances being stretched, cross-border subsidies become a challenge. And actually, I'm glad that Aida is here. I mean, that kind of context where multilateralism is essential, I mean, the role of MDBs is key.
Yeah. I think, Gauri, if you could give us your thoughts on this, and I'm specifically thinking of the discussion that we had just a few minutes ago. You at IRENA, of course, have done a tremendous amount of work on renewable energy and supportive policies for that globally. And I think back to the days when 10 megawatts was a big solar project, and now we do gigawatts and don't even think about it. You talked about scaling up. Could you give us some of your thoughts about how do we get on the same track with scaling up green hydrogen?
So thanks, and thanks for having me here. We've actually just come out of the IRENA assembly that saw policymakers, ministers from almost 140 countries discussing on various issues, including energy security. Of course, that's now become a big concern, and the role that green hydrogen can play in it. And what we did hear a lot from the countries is their very strong concern on how hydrogen can actually be a way to do local creation, just as Aida said. So it cannot be like you had Mauritania, which is of course an ideal site for producing green hydrogen given the huge renewable energy sources that they have, and exporting it to Europe. But at the same time, I think they don't want to do it without having a very clear plan of development, and to be able to also get the energy access to the people in Mauritania. So I think for a lot of countries in the south, it's about balancing how you move forward with getting green hydrogen, and whether it should be just export oriented. But what I do want to highlight here is just a couple of things. From our analysis, what we have really seen is with the growing regionalization of the energy relations, that you would see moving from now to 2050 a much more emphasis on green hydrogen being produced for local consumption and domestic consumption. So we estimate almost 2/3 of the global capacity being used domestically, and about 1/3 that moves cross-border. We estimate that about half of that would come with pipelines, and the remaining getting shipped as ammonia. So if you're talking about large-scale usage of hydrogen domestically, I think the policy framework that's supportive of getting the usage of green hydrogen done for decarbonization of the manufacturing sector, or to be able to have the fertilizer industry getting decarbonized. Those are all very major strategy moves that countries will have to take. Because if you don't get to the scale, you're really not getting to cost competitive green hydrogen. And a country which has the potential to have green hydrogen produced in the country using its renewable sources would want to not just have an export strategy. And if you talk about the Middle East, for example, where the UAE has this hydrogen leadership roadmap, what they're really doing is about leveraging the energy infrastructure that exists in the country and in the region, looking at the skilled manpower that's there, and leveraging it to export blue hydrogen currently to Europe. So it's very different strategies, but at the end of it, I think it's going to be all about cost and bringing down cost rapidly, and that cannot happen just on building bilaterals, which are very specific and have two sets of countries maybe involved in it, but you just need to bring in much more domestic usage for getting that kind of scale.
Thank you. And thinking further on that point, Luc, you obviously at EDF, you're a French company, but you're CEO of the Middle East here. And you've got a very strong track record in renewables in this region. When you come to hydrogen, how do you think about that balance of local use versus exports, and what kind of drives you to make a decision on one or the other?
Interestingly, we are both one of the largest utility in Europe and the largest developer, or one of the leading developer of renewable energy in the global south. So we are on both sides of the table on this topic. All of this, in fact, if we summarize, is about the location of the renewable resources and the location of the end use. So how do you, when you're talking about green energy, how do you manage this difference of localizations of the end use and the resources? So all of this is about this transfer. And in fact, there are three ways to manage these transfers. The first one is to transfer the electricity. And there are several projects of HVDC lines. Everybody knows about the link, but also the transmission lines between Egypt and Greece, or there are several projects ongoing. The second way is to use hydrogen or another product to transfer this energy between global south and global north. But we all know also the challenges about transport of hydrogen that cannot be completely overcome. And the last way is to transfer the end use. And all of us, we know that, for example, transferring data is much easier than transferring electricity or energy. So our conviction as EDF is that we have to work on those three aspects of the transfer. We cannot focus on only one solution, because all those topics have their own challenges. So we have to work on those three ways. So we are highly involved in HVDC projects, despite let's say the huge technical issues and also shortage in the supply chain. We are highly involved in the H2 business and developing projects in several locations, in Oman, in Morocco, in Egypt, for example, but also in Australia, in Chile. So in all the strategic locations that we have been identifying. And we are also highly involved in developing usage of electricity in the global south, which is, let's say, probably the most efficient, economically efficient solution if you identify the right usage. And data centers is clearly something we need to work on, because data centers, transferring data is extremely easy. So developing data centers close to the location of renewable energy in the global south is probably a very good way to manage this. So we are working on those three solutions. And regarding H2 specifically, I think the main challenges now we need to overcome is not technical, is the difference in the costs between blue and green hydrogen, and which leads to the value you put in the carbon. In fact, so all of this is about subsidizing or putting a cost on the carbon impact of blue hydrogen and let's say a carbon generation. And until Europe and Japan and let's say main end user of hydrogen are not putting a very strong value and tangible value on the carbon, we don't believe that the market will be really unlocked.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very interesting, point about data as well. And specifically when we think about this region, I think we think about green corridors and we think of fuels and so on. But data is also part of these corridors, and we know there's various projects for international interconnectivity, which include pipelines and sea routes, but also data. And thinking about the Middle East, I'd like to really open this to the whole panel, whoever would like to comment on this. The Middle East has some important international transport routes, obviously the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, and land routes across the Middle East as well. And what are the panels thinking about the Middle East's role in green hydrogen corridors as an area that can quite easily supply East Asia, Japan, Korea, and so on, South Asia, and Europe as well? Is the Middle East going to be a central core region for these developing global hydrogen corridors? Gary?
No, I think the Middle East actually sits in a very advantageous position, given that many countries in the region have now come up with very clear strategies on what's the kind of trajectory they want to take on hydrogen. And as I mentioned, these are also countries which have a huge base of skilled workforce, and also the kind of cost of capital that they can access is remarkably, as compared to any other developing country. I think this is a huge advantage. But also the fact that, there's already emphasis on going from the blue to the green route. That is clearly a way forward where these countries can start establishing themselves as also the energy centers for the future. And, building it into a strong energy for the future kind of a strategy is something that will put this region, which has well-developed infrastructure, the ports and shipping routes that come through this place. I think they really stand at a very advantageous position.
If I can further echo that. So when we were starting to work on green hydrogen, we were just wondering where to start, right? Which country to focus on. And we just quickly started thinking about what matters. And we then published it. We generally don't publish things, but we published a ranking of countries and criteria to determine that. So what matters? Clearly, general investability matters, and the Gulf certainly ticks that box. Potential for local consumption, we had discussed, that's very important. Infrastructure, quality of infrastructure, and I guess with that geostrategic positioning is really important. And levelized cost of electricity. So these are big ticks, clearly, for the Middle East. What could be done in addition is perhaps a bit of regulatory support towards more local consumption or more incentive to locally decarbonize as well. Generally, you're absolutely right. The thesis initially had been, look, decarbonization is for the global north. The global south shouldn't be constrained by that, but actually it's the right thing to do. I remember anecdotally growing up in Turkey, in Ankara actually, which was an extremely polluted city, heating with local coal. And one day the government decided to bring in natural gas from Azerbaijan and Russia at great cost to the Turkish economy, and we all benefited through clean air, right? It's then a matter of putting a price on it in a context where the government finances are extremely constrained and the cross-border subsidy allocation topic needs to be dealt with. But yeah, I mean, so the Middle East, in summary, is exceptionally placed. Is it the only exceptionally placed location? Probably not, but it's geostrategically as well very advantageous.
And I mean, the Middle East and the Gulf, particularly a big centre of the maritime industry as well. I wonder, again, if the panel has thoughts around how do you develop that maritime supply chain in terms of, you know, you need port infrastructure. If you're shipping ammonia, that's quite a different thing from shipping oil and gas, oil and LNG. If you're shipping pure hydrogen, another challenge again. How do you ensure that ships can refuel if a ship is designed around ammonia? Can it get ammonia at every port that it calls at? What does this region need to do to ensure that it has the right port infrastructure and logistics?
Look, maybe I'll step in here. Look, I think nobody would doubt that this region has the capacity to do all of this infrastructure. I mean, those of us that live in the region, you know, have seen it grow. I mean, you know, I think outside of China, you know, this is the other part of the world where you look at the capacity to deliver mega projects and it's phenomenal. So to underestimate this region, you know, would be a huge mistake. And we've also seen the world's first mega green hydrogen project happening in Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, there's a clear demonstration of this region's capacity to deliver. But I think one of the earlier panels, Alicia Eastman was on that panel, and she was talking about a lot of the work that the IMO and the shipping companies are doing to advance their agenda. Because I think one of the issues we've got, sort of coming back to that theme of, you know, global disconnectedness for green hydrogen versus how the electron sector developed, is, you know, look at SAF. SAF's a great example. You know, in Europe, everyone's going to have to use SAF, so all airlines are penalized a little bit, consumers get penalized a little bit, but it's a choice. But in the Middle East, you know, if one airline takes the lead, it's taking an economic hit versus its competitors. So everybody here also has to work together, and, you know, there has to be some coordination taking place. Otherwise, why are people taking that first step and penalizing their own economies? So the shipping industry is one of those industries, though, that if at a global level, they all, you know, the biggest shipping companies do come together, you know, let's say under an IMO umbrella, you can see a situation where everybody's willing to pay a little bit more. And in that situation, you know, the Middle East is super well positioned to sell methanol, ammonia to the shipping industry. As you said, it's in the right place. The infrastructure capacity is amazing. The renewable energy capacity is amazing. And governments here are world leading now. You know, the policy that's coming out of the Middle East is really, really accelerating.
Yes, that's a great thought. Aida, perhaps you have some thoughts around this. You know, how do you, as a multilateral financial institution, how do you help drive that kind of coordination and get countries aligned on, you know, yes, we need to invest in certain low carbon approaches like this one?
Well, I mean, a big part of our job is the policy engagement. It's actually talking to the governments, helping them define the vision, the hydrogen strategies. But it still comes down to the money. And we're also investing in financing. But it comes down to this circularity that I mentioned before, that you offtake, bankers want offtake. To get offtake, you need market, you need demand creation. To get demand creation, you need to have low costs. To get low costs, you need scale. To get scale, you need demand creation. So to break that circularity, yeah, you have to move in parallel, but to break that circularity, you really, I mean, it's a question of government support at some point, and really enabling environment to help scale things up so that the hydrogen is capable of competing with alternative fuels. In our geography, yes, we know a lot of shipping companies looking how to decarbonize, but it's not everywhere. And we have countries who continue to burn diesel, you know, because there's no explicit carbon cost to that. And you know, the biggest market failure, you know, climate change is the biggest market failure. Why? Because nobody's pricing, I mean, except for EU, for example, CBAM. So where we work, we're helping our countries, especially those who plan to start exports into EU, and when it comes in 26, CBAM, their manufacturing base has to be prepared for it. So we help them green up in places like Turkey, like Central Asia. Things have to change. They have to start burning something green, which would be hydrogen. But it's really down to pricing the carbon by the governments, and that's where we come in.
Yeah, and we're nearly out of time now, but I think it's just one more thing that I would like to ask Luc. I think you have a perspective on this. Aida talks about pricing carbon. Is there one policy, whether from your consuming side or your producing side, that would really help you in advancing your green hydrogen projects?
To be frank, it's the whole regulatory environment in Europe or in Japan that needs to be built and fast, because on different note that what has been said, there are huge resources here, but Middle East is not going to wait for Europe or Asia to move. Projects are moving very fast. Local consumption of energy can move very fast also. We have seen the LTC project announced yesterday. I don't see Middle East participating or waiting for Europe to build these corridors while there is a whole industry that can be built here. Let's see, but I think it's urgent that Europe and Asia moved on those regulatory topics to unlock the market.
Thank you. So that's all we've got time for today, but thanks very much to my panelists. Really a very interesting and in-depth discussion and some real expertise from actual projects and developments on the ground. And I think we're in a very appropriate place to talk about these green corridors, and hopefully indeed we'll see some of them emerging and developing over the next few years. So thank you to all the audience and to my panelists.